We're here with Aaron Brody, the director of the Brody Museum in Berkeley, and he would like to share his thoughts about the issue, the very thorny issue of repatriation.
Thank you. So I was actually asked to think about this idea by a journal editor fairly recently, so I'd like to share some of my thoughts on this, because it's a very complex set of issues. Now luckily, because of the way our materials were, most of our holdings were excavated and exported, we can at least know that legally these materials belong here. But many of these questions, it's not just about legality or the law, it's also about ethics. And that's can raise, several gray zones. But let me just back up, because in case you didn't see some of the earlier videos, so these materials came to Berkeley, California in the 1920s and 30s. My predecessor, William Brody, excavated them in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. So he chose a site called Tel El Nasbe and received permits from the British Department of Antiquities, based in Jerusalem, to excavate this site in 5 different seasons between the years of 1926 to 1935. So each one of those seasons, 5 seasons, he did receive the permit. Now, at the time, the land that makes up the archaeological site was owned by several different families. And so he had to also not only be permitted by the Department of Antiquities, but find the landowner, make sure that it was okay to rent the land for excavation, and also needed to, so he paid the rental fee, but then also had to compensate the owners for the crops that were not able to be grown, if that makes sense, at the time. So that was also done, I would say, in an ethical manner. And then after the material was excavated, there was a system which has this fancy French name called partage, a legal system by which, at the time, the excavator could legally export a certain percentage of the finds. I believe the law at the time was a 50-50 split with the Department of Antiquities of the Mandate of Palestine. And so then those, that split of the material that belonged to the project sponsor was then also legally exported here to Berkeley, California. So that is a little bit involved sort of with some of the legal issues. So all of this was done prior to 1935, I believe. So legal, of course, according to the laws of the time. But as a current director, I have to think also about the ethics of it. Is this a collection that was came to us ethically, and is it sort of should it remain here according to sort of the ethics of today, not the ethics of the 1920s and 30s? And I came to the conclusion, yes, now obviously I'm a bit of a biased source, but I believe that the collection is doing more good here in California as a place of research and education than it would if it were repatriated to the Middle East. Now I should also back that up by saying, so I've been a director here for 16 and a half years, and during that time I have never been contacted by any official, either from the Palestinian Authority or from the modern state of Israel, asking for its return. That has not come up. And it also raises the question of, to whom would the material be returned? So from a standpoint of modern political boundaries, the site itself is actually surrounded now by the modern city of Ramallah, and is within the territory of the Palestinian Authority, which has its own, I believe it's a Department of Antiquities or some equivalent. But in terms of antiquity and a kind of ethnic identification, the site itself was within the territory of the ancient kingdom of Judah, and so has sort of ties to not only to the Judean kingdom, but in some ways to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. So that raises questions as well. So would this collection be returned to the Palestinian Authority or to the modern state of Israel? We haven't had to make that decision, so, but again, nor have I been asked. But I think, the real important thing about the collection, and I should back up by saying it's the largest collection of its type west of Chicago. So it's, in terms of the western United States, it has an importance there. And it gives modern museum visitors a chance to see these kinds of artifacts that really they can't see in most places in the western US. And as it's getting more expensive for people to actually, and sometimes actually not feasible, to visit parts of the Middle East, having these kinds of collections, I would say, outside of the areas of origin has its importance in terms of education and access to the ancient past that for the vast majority of Americans who actually don't even have passports and will never leave the country, has its vitality and its importance. And then I think the final thought is that many of these artifacts, while they are in museums, are not unique. There are actually warehouses in Israel and Palestine that are filled with these kinds of artifacts. And so I believe that that's part of the reason why no one has ever asked me to repatriate them, because they are in some ways a dime a dozen in the Middle East, whereas here they are unique. And so I think their importance and the kind of education that they can provide is really vital to a West Coast audience and supersedes some of these ethical questions.
So if someone had an antiquity and they thought it was somewhere Holy Land, and they wanted to donate it to the museum, what would you do?
That's a good question. We actually have a collections policy, which you can see on our website. We only will accept donations of provenienced materials. And so if someone has purchased something, say in Jerusalem or perhaps in Amman, that sort of thing, and we do not have documentation of known provenience, then following our collections policy, we would not take that object.
So if something were on the art market for some period of time, and let's just say it was purchased at an auction in the 1920s or 30s, would that be enough for you?
I personally would have to check the, I believe it's the UNESCO decisions in the early 1970s, but I would have to do a kind of thorough, sort of legal study, and then also, again, think about things ethically. But I think if it was collected prior to 1971, and excuse me if I got that date wrong, that we certainly would consider it. But I think if it was purchased after that date, it falls in a kind of different category.
So do people come here from the Middle East to study this collection because it is a known site with documentation? Is it something that is a resource internationally?
Yes, actually. So currently we have a number of Israeli archaeologists who are interested in aspects of the collection and are doing contextual research, using the documentation resources that we have here, as well as the artifacts. There have also been some European scholars who have worked on the collection, and then some folks around the United States and maybe even Canada as well.
So if someone wanted to borrow one of these pieces to put on a show internationally, what would be your thought on that?
I think that would be absolutely fine. We would have to check with registrars on both ends to make sure that that the borrower, had proper facilities and that sort of thing. But I think that would further our mission in terms of, sharing the collection and sharing the knowledge that goes with that, and encouraging visitorship, whether it's here in Berkeley or other locations around the world.
And does the museum have a policy in accepting something that would be loaned to the museum?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, and is that available on the website?
No, I don't think we have our, sort of policies about loans, but one can just contact me by email.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you very much.
Sure.